The story of the Whitestown Fire Department actually begins before the department itself. In the late 1800s, towns began sprouting up along the eventual railroad lines across the new prairie. Whitestown would become a stop on the Big Four line from Cincinnati to St. Louis. Named for the railroad's president, Albert S. White, Whitestown was a legitimate boomtown, growing rapidly with the rail traffic and shortly thereafter, a traction line from Indianapolis. In 1887, it was published that this bustling town was home to 2 churches, 4 grocery stores, 3 clothing stores, a druggist, a miller, a hotel, 2 doctors, 1 lawyer, and 3 boarding homes. Industrially, the town had a stave mill, 2 grist mills, 2 tile factories, a brickyard, a grain elevator, and several individual blacksmiths and carpenters. And what we often brag about in the growth of this town today is in fact a second act, almost a century later. But this boomtown had its troubles too. With 2 gambling halls, 2 saloons, a dance hall, and 1 house of ill repute, trouble was always waiting in the wings. One of the earliest printed news stories reflecting this was when some fellows from Royalton caused trouble with a shoot-up at the Monte Carlo Roadhouse in 1904. Add to this many reports of arson, including this tiny, ominous report buried in the Indianapolis Star in 1896. An attempt was made this past week to burn the village of Whitestown, fires being started in several places. Around the turn of the century, there were several published stories of fires in the town of a suspicious nature, often noted as incendiary. These fires were always fought locally, with bucket brigades being filled from local water wells. Among these stories, a few stand out. In July of 1915, several papers reported on the spectacular midnight fire at the Jenkins and Cohee grain elevator. The fire exhausted all of the wells in town, and a request for help was sent to the Indianapolis Fire Department. However, by 3 a.m., the fire had burned itself to a point of control. As told by resident Glenn Hauser, the fire burned bright all night and was said to have been seen for miles. It was several days before it went out. But the turning point and the catalyst for the fire department as we know it today was the massive fire of April 2, 1929. This fire was widely reported and cost the town a lodge, Heinz hardware store, and the bank. Both the Indianapolis and Lebanon fire departments responded to the fire, which eventually cost over $40,000 in damages. On April 3rd, the Indianapolis Star ran a tiny column that highlighted the lack of fire protection in both Whitestown and Brazil, Indiana, after recent large fires. It's possible that this prompted the trustee, Samuel West, to make a change. Well, Samuel West and a handful of volunteers made that change, and while little is known for certain, it is recorded that the Whitestown Fire Department began in May of 1929. It was called the Worth Township Fire Department at the time. Still a bucket brigade, the organized department consisted of foundation members Allen, Grover Allen, Minnie Sorter, Albert Hine, Horace Wheat, and Clyde Loeffner. 1 year later, the first fire truck was purchased for the department, a 1930 Chevrolet Hal Pumper. This truck was housed in Grover Allen's garage, originally located on Main Street, but then moved to Pierce Street in what would eventually become the Belmar Building, which still stands today. In 1934, another massive fire swept the town, destroying the Heinz hardware store, once again, and the Allen grocery store, among other things. The fire was almost contained when the wells were pumped dry. The 1930 Howe was a good pumper for a while, but then became plagued with troubles. Whitestown author Toby McDaniel tells of the day that Jack Tucker Pipe's house caught on fire. The Pipe's house was right next to the school and just around the corner from the Allen's garage where the truck was stored. Being stored in the back of a mechanic's garage, the first step to responding the truck was to move the other vehicles out of the way. Once that was accomplished, the truck could be started and respond, if it had gas, which on more than one occasion it did not. On this fateful day in 1946, it also had a dead battery and had been pushed to the corner gas station. McDaniel reports that the trucks could be seen from the school sitting at the pumps with several men working feverishly to get it started. By then, trucks from Lebanon and Zionsville had arrived, but the house was already lost. The very next day, an article ran in the Muncie Evening Press. Whitestown firemen wish they had horses. The trustee at the time, Albert Neese, decided a change was again needed, and the first official firehouse was built. A small block 2-bay garage was built on the only property that the township owned, right next to the schoolhouse, in the summer of 1946. Albert Hine, one of the founding members of the department, and a janitor at the school, maintained the truck and the station. Again, McDaniel writes of how Hine wouldn't let the students touch the old 1930 for fear that it wouldn't start if needed. 2 new trucks were purchased soon after, a 1947 Howe pumper, and a 1948 Howe tanker. These trucks would serve the department well into the 1960s. The last living member of the original fire department was photographed at an open house in 1980. H.O. Horace Wheat was well known among the town and the firemen, but passed away in 1985 at the age of 89. This left a gap in the history of our department, but as a senior in high school in 1953, John Hancock was only a few years removed from the foundation when he became a fireman, and would eventually become the chief of the department for many years. Well, from here, we'll let those that live the history tell the history.
Senior in high school, before it was in October, November, something might have been December, the fire siren was right outside of the high school, and the principal was on the department. That siren rang forever, and he finally, it was between classes, and he finally said, "John, Fluff, come with me." We went to Harry Edder's farm, which is west of town on County Road 500, cornfield fire. Mounted picker, instead of driving along the side of it, he drove through the standing corn. We got there in our 47 Chevy pumper. You'd drive away, stop, put it in gear, and we could hose it down, stop, drive a little bit farther. But that started my career in 1953. Mm-hmm. And I stayed with it for 35, 36 years. Now, I can't tell you exactly 86, 87 when I finally left the department.